Since this is second in a series, I'm going to very quickly telescope what the first in the series covered, and if you want more of that, you will need to consult that or some of my writings. But I think I can telescope it in a way that will not make unintelligible what follows. We need to begin with a shared concept of critical thinking here, and so let me tell you very briefly what that concept is as I understand it. And I'll put it in terms first of ordinary language, and then I'll translate it into a little more technical language, which will be part of the thread which I develop in the course of this session. Here is a very ordinary language statement of what critical thinking is. It's a process whereby the mind takes charge of itself by understanding how it thinks and what makes it think better, and it uses this knowledge and translates that knowledge into skill in self-improvement in thinking. Shorthand, critical thinking is thinking that assesses itself through knowledge of itself, knowledge of its deficiencies, and knowledge of its strengths. Alternative formulation, critical thinking is self-directed thinking disciplined by knowledge of the intellectual criteria and standards whereby you can assess your own thinking. Or, finally, in a kind of catchy way, critical thinking is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to make your thinking better. And learning what's involved in doing that and then doing it is what critical thinking is about. So critical thinking by its very nature involves thinking interacting with thinking in a self-reflexive way. Everybody thinks it's of our nature to think, and we think in sometimes insightful ways, sometimes in narrow ways, sometimes clearly, sometimes unclearly, sometimes in a relevant way and sometimes in an irrelevant way, and so on. But our mind does not automatically pick out which is which. Because in addition to the innate capacity which we share to be reasoning creatures, we have more to our nature than that. We're also egocentric creatures. And our egos play tricks upon us. They deceive us in certain very specific ways. The mind strongly gravitates toward beliefs which are comfortable, for example, whereas truth has no necessary connection to what it is that is comfortable to believe. Truth, or rather our sense of what is true, gravitates toward the ideas we have heard most frequently expressed as true by people around us who are significant others to us: our parents, our teachers, our playmates, our peers and colleagues. The mind naturally gravitates toward the view that these ideas are true because people that we care about hold them. But there is no correlation in reality necessarily between people that we admire, like, and respect and the truth of their ideas. And therefore, some very natural tendencies of the human mind need to be corrected by abilities to recognize possible pitfalls and try to intervene in our thinking with strategies which enable us to catch ourselves at our worst and improve our thinking. This, of course, is not being done with the notion of feeling bad about ourselves or thinking, gee, why isn't our thinking better? Or why should I look at my thinking in a negative way? The point is simply that our thinking is our guide in life. As we think, so we act. See a situation one way, you act in a way corresponding to it. If somebody seems to you in your thinking to be your enemy, you treat them as your enemy. If somebody seems to be in your mind your friend, you treat them as your friend. But sometimes those who seem to be our friends are our enemies. And sometimes those who seem to be our enemies have no malicious intentions toward us. And therefore, once again, if we're going to get beyond the weaknesses of the human mind when it functions at the lower level, we have to develop the capacities for it to function at the higher levels. Unfortunately, the lower levels are instinctive. The higher levels require cultivation. And so you don't have to train somebody to believe what they want to believe. What they want to believe, they naturally gravitate toward. But to believe something that is a painful truth requires discipline, in which we resist some of these natural tendencies. So this is the concept, the general concept of critical thinking, and then the question becomes, well, what do you have to do that? What does this have to do with teaching kindergarten reading, or taking the children on a vacation, or going on a picnic, or interrelating with your children, or teaching chemistry, or teaching physics, or teaching nursing, or teaching literature? What does it have to do with that? Well, it has this to do with it, that whenever students are learning, whenever we're learning and we're behaving, we're using our minds, well or poorly. And it's in our interest to use them well, just as it is in our interest to keep our body in as fit a condition as we can. And in the same way, as you develop physical fitness, put a little energy into developing your body, it becomes easier and easier and you feel better. But initially, it doesn't feel so good, and your body resists. So too does the mind. Now, what are some of the things which we have to learn in order to do what I'm talking about? I want to introduce a kind of technical concept here and translate critical thinking into it. I put on the overhead here three concepts: the logic of reasoning, the logic of the content, and the logic of the student's thinking, or the logic of your thinking, if you want to learn. The logic of reasoning represents that part of our mind which needs to be developed if we are to function in a higher order rather than a lower order way. We have to be reasoners. And we have to develop our capacity to reason, because reason, which comes from the word ratio in Latin and goes back ultimately to an European root, means to figure out. To figure out. To reason critically involves to figure out with standards, going back to the Greek word criterion, which means standard or test, and the Greek word kritikos, which means to discern and judge. We develop our reasoning. In developing our reasoning, we're developing that part of our mind which constructs, analyzes, manipulates, and assesses logic. And when I say logic, I don't mean what may happen or has happened in traditional formal or informal logic courses. I mean something much broader than that. I mean it in the sense in which the following expressions are intelligible: the logic of tennis, the logic of chess, the logic of numbers, the logic of modern physics, the logic of pathology, pathologic, biologic, biology, sociologic, sociology, psychologic, anthropologic, anthropology, the logic of your personal relationships, the logic of your parenting, the logic of your subconscious mind, the logic of the news, the logic of the media, the logic of experience. All of those expressions are intelligible within the logic of the English language. That is, if you look up the word logic in the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find that those meanings are quite consistent with the traditional use of the word. What is it that all of those uses capture? It captures what exists when there is a system of logical relationships that exist either between ideas or realities. Now let me give you an example. What is it that biologists are trying to do? They're trying to construct a system of ideas which makes sense of the logic of living things. What does that assume? It assumes that living things have a logic. That is, they are not the way living things function, and the interrelationships there are not anything you damn well please to make them. They're a specific kind of thing which can be discovered or not discovered. The logic of anatomy, physiology, is perfectly logical. Why? Because our anatomy and physiology is. That is, the fundamental assumption of all science and pursuit of knowledge is that reality is logical. It doesn't mean, of course, that it matches any particular logic we've constructed, because we may not yet have constructed the particular logic that this reality represents, but that it can be done. Not totally, not completely, not exclusively, maybe not even absolutely. I'm not talking about metaphysics here. I'm talking about practically and actually. That is, in principle, you can understand your relationship to your husband or your wife. It isn't unintelligible. It may be tricky, it may be mysterious, it may be counterfeited, it may not be completely disclosed, it may be painful. But it's there, it can be understood. And when it's understood, it all makes sense in a system. This is the basic idea that drives the mind forward, that the natural relationship between the development of reason and the development of that which reason is reasoning about. And if somebody says, well, what if our minds are tailor-made to deceive us even when we reason, and that reality is constructed in some way that it'll always remain unintelligible to us? Well then, let's close up the universities and let's tear down the libraries and let's just have some fun. Because all of that is a deception. But we can't proceed on that assumption. Science never proceeds on the assumption. No seeker of knowledge proceeds on the assumption that maybe we understand all we can understand. Maybe we've reached the end. Maybe this puzzle can't be solved. No, there always is that confidence, or at least that drive, to figure it out, to reason it through, and to make sense of it. Even when people come up with what might be called contradictory logics, they show why that makes sense. In other words, they make it logical. The human mind simply does not accept that anything in principle cannot be understood. Well, in any case, this is the concept.